The American buildup with U.S. Marines arriving in the Middle East outside the Strait of Hormuz is almost complete. American President Donald Trump says he has received 8 oil shipments in the form of tankers as a gift from the Iranians. Meanwhile, Pakistani efforts to broker talks and facilitate mediation seem to be going nowhere, and Pakistan's embassy in Tehran has been bombed. All of this as the Americans have issued another evacuation alert for citizens in the United Arab Emirates. Welcome to another episode of Let Ali Show You, this time with the tensions not subsiding, in fact, the war expanding in the Middle East, the US-Israel war on Iran. Other actors in the region seem to be getting sucked in. Pakistan has been in the news for the past few days with the Trump administration saying that it's playing some sort of facilitation or even mediation role to get the Iranians and the Americans on the same table. But Israel seems to be the spoiler. To get an idea of where the situation stands as is, and if we can expect ground forces, American ground forces, to land in Iran in the next day, couple of days, or whenever, I'm joined by senior journalist, documentarian. Well, there's so many titles that you have, Robert Young Pelton. Thank you so much for joining us, Robert. Let's begin with where you see this conflict as is and where it stands.
Okay, so I think we're framing this as another sort of Middle Eastern war, maybe even in a singular sense, and I don't see it that way. I see the idea of move fast and break things. In other words, a business concept. And I see that Trump is running out of time. If he doesn't win the midterms, he's not going to have as much authority or power. And he's got to do something. He's got to knock something loose. So once you knock over the world order, all the players jump in and say, ice cream for everybody. And what Israel wants is not what America wants. And what the Gulf nations want is not what Iran wants. So you're seeing this sort of haphazard, multifaceted free-for-all, right? America has no reason to be involved in the war in Iran. We don't have any threats from any nuclear weapons. We don't have any imminent, terrorist threats. None of those things exist. As a matter of fact, we were sitting negotiating with Iranians before this started. So the other threat, though, is Israel is very aggressively expanding their territory towards Lebanon. They're also very aggressively active in the West Bank. And they're also still carrying on in Gaza. Nobody's paying attention to Gaza, but it's clear that there's an expansion of territory under the guise of sort of fighting Iran and their subsets like Hezbollah. So I see it as sort of somebody walks into a bar and says, fight, and everybody starts beating each other over the heads with chairs and, fisticuffs, but it's quite confusing. And if we stop, if Donald Trump, which he'll do on, I think it's Monday, he says that we won the war, and on Friday he threatens somebody. When we get to that point, the war is going to continue. You see the president of Ukraine in Saudi Arabia. He's there to support the war of the Saudis against Iran. I mean, that's a totally different war that just popped up. So that's what I see.
You've been covering conflicts all your life, 50 years on. Have you seen something like this play out as far as the Americans are concerned with a character like Donald Trump? And as you said, in the beginning of the week, by Sunday night, there's talk of peace and negotiations. And by the weekend, by Friday evening, hostilities start again. And then you have the role of Israel that goes in and starts bombing, takes out all of these off-ramps. In fact, there were negotiations, as you mentioned, going on between Iran and the United States when the US and Israel decided to go kill Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and start their bombing campaign.
I wasn't born yet, but World War I sort of reminds me of this, where you had two sort of groups of people that were raring to go at each other, and they used an assassination in Serbia as an excuse, right? So I see these people saying, okay, there's only one window for this. In a peaceful environment, you can't just start wars by just assassinating people and bombing things and taking property, right? So What Donald Trump likes to do is every day he says something silly, and then every week he does something stupid. And if he repeats that enough, people forget what he did last week. I mean, we've completely forgotten about Mexico and Venezuela and Greenland, Canada, and all these other almost wars. But this one is, I call this the tar baby war. If you know the story about Brer Rabbit, where they put up this tar baby and Brer Rabbit starts insulting it and he starts hitting it and he gets stuck. The more angrier he gets, the more he gets stuck, right? And America is very susceptible to what they call the escalation trap. We sent advisors to South Vietnam. Suddenly we send troops. We get into wars that build themselves because our military is very large. And, people talk about, we're sending 8,000 troops. No, those troops need about 9 times, 10 times more people to support them, whether it's laundry or, cleaning or whatever. They don't operate in a vacuum. They need an infrastructure. So I've seen wars where something obtuse happens, like, Russia was doing this in places like Chechnya, where they had the apartment bombings, or in Georgia. They come up with an excuse. They used to do this in Nagorno-Karabakh. They come up with an excuse, and then they go to rescue those people, and then they end up stealing a chunk of land. But this is much bigger. This is upsetting the entire global economy. And whether Donald Trump likes it or not, we live in a globalized society where something that happens here has a direct effect over there. And I think this is the scale that we have to look at this war. It's not like 10,000 troops lined up against 10,000 troops. It's hundreds, thousands, millions of decisions being made by people about what do they do when they don't have fuel, when the prices go up, or they don't have a job, or they can't travel, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I see.
Yeah, you mentioned this is unlike anything that we've seen. It was supposed to be, quote unquote, a weekend war. You take out the leadership, you decapitate them, and then everything folds. They had Venezuela as a precedent where they took out Maduro and everything kind of just fell into their laps. But the Iranian response, especially with attacking or targeting civilian infrastructure, military installations, American bases in the Middle East, in these Gulf Arab states, using Shahed drones, blocking off the Strait of Hormuz, and basically creating a pole or a polling station, sort of, where the Iranians are now taking kickbacks to let tankers pass. A lot of things have changed so rapidly. And now there's talk of the Americans actually suffering some sort of strategic defeat, so to speak. Tell us about the Strait of Hormuz. Tell us about the arrival of these Marines, and tell us about the simultaneous effort to find an off-ramp with these talks, or lack of talks, I guess.
You might be talking to one of the few people that actually sailed through the Straits of Hormuz, right? And it's an interesting place because it's extraordinarily hot this time of year, and it's getting hotter. The water temperature is something like 75, 80 degrees. On the eastern side, you have these steep hills that overlook that little bend, right? And then you have these little flat islands. They're very hot, right? There's no shade, there's no shelter. Some of them have water, but for the most part, they're just flat, almost like sandbars. And the tankers move very, very slowly, to get around that sort of turn. These tankers at best do 12 knots, something like that, but they're taking their time because they're in these lanes, right? So they're heading both ways. The thing that struck me when Donald Trump said that he was going to send military to open the Straits of Hormuz, I said they're going to be open by the time they get there, and I've already been proven right. In other words, this is a very arbitrary thing that Iran is doing, right? It's going to look very silly attacking and seizing the Straits of Hormuz when there's no obstacle to the flow of oil, and yet probably another problem will be created by Iran. And you remember that coastline, if you look at a map, you have to not only travel that way, but you've also got the Houthis on the other side if you have to go through the Suez. So it's not that simple to just open or close the straits. Secondly, the maritime industry, which I know pretty well, is not interested in running the gauntlet. Those poor Chinese sailors and the Greek ships and whoever owns the oil at the time, China or whatever, is zero interest in getting blown up or getting killed or burned or whatever just because they broke a rule. That's why you see that $2 million toll, right? They have the ability to cut deals to get their product out of a danger zone and into the customer's hands. But really what I want people to what I want people to understand is that the rule of law is being broken. Once you break the rule of law, once you start a war for arbitrary reasons with no support, no popular support, no ally support, you're a bandit. You're a rogue nation. You might as well go invade France. You might as well steal somebody's luggage. I mean, there's no walls anymore, right? So this is, I think, what should bother people is it's a war without limits, barriers, or controls, or any sense of purpose or ending or structure. And that's perfect for Iran because Iran can do chaos a lot better than America can. We're on the other side of the world. So if Donald Trump says something on Monday morning, Iran will do something Monday afternoon to make him look. And you've seen this over and over again, like a football game, right? He says this, boom, it gets kicked back. So I just think it's a very different war, and it's going to affect all of us.
So the escalation ladder for Iran is much easier to climb than it is for the Americans. Focus on these troops, the USS Tripoli, Marines arriving. You mentioned the coastline, you mentioned the Zagros Mountains, and you mentioned sailing through the bends of the Strait of Hormuz. How difficult is it? Because you had Lindsey Graham a few days ago saying, we've done Iwo Jima. This shouldn't be an issue for us. And now they're talking about Kharg Island, which might be a distraction. Then you've got the Qasem Island, and you've got so many different islands, and then you've got the mainland. How difficult is it when you talk about the scale and you talk about the forces that are apparently arriving here?
Okay, so pretend you're a general. Somebody lays out a map of the region. And the first thing you notice is that there's Iran, and there's all these little Gulf countries, tiny little things, and there's Saudi Arabia. And you kind of say, okay, how do I control that area? Well, if I take this island, which I'm sure you can, right? Send 1,000 troops to take, size of Manhattan. Suddenly all these missiles fly over and land in Qatar or Bahrain or UAE or, there's no logical, force on force concept to this. As soon as you create that chaos, that lawlessness I'm telling you about, the entire commercial sector, which includes ships and people who buy oil and people who get hired to transport it, stop. They don't want to play that game. They're not combatants, right? They're not going to sail regardless of how many jet fighters, how many helicopters, how many troops, because one simple missile, one inflammatory event just goes boom, right? And these are all tankers. These are LNG carriers, right? Iran's already taken out a number of the actual processing plants, right? When you take Kharg Island, you're not stealing or blocking Iran's oil. You're blocking China's oil. So this isn't sort of an A plus B equals C scenario. This is just random chaos that falls right into the lap of Iran.
Random chaos falling into the laps of Iran. And then you have these princely states, the Gulf Arab states, which have claimed that, oh, we're not part of this. Why you're attacking us? The Emirates, you've got Qatar, you've got Bahrain, you've got Kuwait. And now the UAE has come out, Al-Otaiba, the ambassador in the US, has come out and said, we are on the side of the Americans against Iran. They seem to be blaming Iran, but the original sin of the Israelis and the Americans attacking Iran seems to be absent from all of their condemnation. Tell us about that first, and then the Israeli mindset going into this with Netanyahu now, some alleging that he's directing all of this.
Okay, so again, I like to zoom back rather than dive in. So when you zoom back, go back to 2010, go back to Arab Spring, when the Gulf states were under threat from what they considered was Iranian-backed Muslim Brotherhood attacks, right? And there's a very clear line between the Gulf nations and the state of Iran. Iran wants to enforce democracy, which sounds weird, but they want these dictators, these potentates, to be removed. On the other side, you have Saudi Arabia, who, depending on what day it is, look at these little sultanates as squatters. They're literally sitting on an oil well, saying, "Hey," and Saudi Arabia's like, "Hey, that's mine. You stole that because some oil company signed a document and gave your tribe the rights to exploit that." And then you have Israel. So what happened was, the first Trump administration, you had what they call the Abraham Accords, which were not new. I mean, the UAE had worked with Israel before, but they decided, like, if we get alongside Israel and we get attacked by Iran, then America has to defend us, because we didn't defend them in 2010. Obama didn't give a shit about who lost their kingship or their sheikhdom or whatever. As a matter of fact, supported things like Gaddafi falling and, for the removal of dictatorships or strongmen. So at the end of the day, the Gulf nations were told incorrectly that if you wrap yourself in the American flag and you align yourself with Israel, America has to defend you.
Yeah.
Well, tactically, that's almost physically impossible. You send one missile into the financial section in UAE, or you send one into the condos along the river there, and people go, whoa, I'm out of here. Like, this is not a place I want to live. So that has turned out to be a mistake. Secondly, they don't really have a choice right now. The Gulf nations are talking to Iran. I mean, they're literally saying, what are you doing, man? What are you doing? We're not at war with you. But America is going to use them because that's where their bases are. Now, a bit of trivia, they can't use those bases. They've been bombed. They're very naked and exposed. They're one hypersonic missile going into a base or into the command center is gone. So it's a very dangerous situation to think that America will defend the Gulf nations against Iran on behalf of Israel, who has their own war, which is then agitating the rest of the world. I mean, to be crude, I call this like effing a porcupine in the rear end. Like, it's going to feel really good when we stop doing this, because we're not doing much to make things better.
And especially at a time when the Americans can't seem to defend their own bases. The New York Times has come out with its own report that they had to move assets to hotels and off base because of the intensity of attacks from Iran with the Shahed drones and the ballistic missiles that were coming in. You're a student of history, finally. You're a student of history. You've reported from these areas. You have decades of observing what has been going on, Robert. This is a seminal moment. It changes things. Things will not be the same beyond it. How do you see it shaping up, first of all, and where does it end?
Okay, so I view this as the official entry point to the multipolar world. We had neoliberalism, or liberal state, after World War II, in which America was the dominant power, Russia was the bad guys, and we kept the world stable. So you had to choose, are you with America? Are you with Soviet Union? And it became a structure. And so we went to countries and said, hey, that's bad. You can't do that. You have to observe human rights. You have to have, elections, blah, blah, blah. That shifted. And now there is no reason to hide under the skirts of America. Because, like Ukraine, if you're fighting for democracy against America's old enemy, they could just wake up one day and say, yeah, I'm bored. Somebody wrote me a check and I think I'm going to go do something else now. That nuked the whole idea that America is the global policeman or the arbiter of democracy or freedom or whatever. What Israel's doing against the Palestinians and the Lebanese and getting back into the old 80s model of just, stealing, bombing, massacring, whatever. This is why America turned away from them. This is why we had all those peace deals, so they'd stop doing that. So I honestly think that in a year from now, people will kind of laugh when you remind them that America used to go around the world and defend people, liberate communist countries and overthrow dictators and things like that, because it's easier to do business with dictators. We just don't do it very well. Like right now, our military is exceptional. I mean, it loves to bomb things, and it puts a little dot on a map and a bomb goes in there, but that's not winning a war. That's just showing off that you design something, that can get from A to B. What we're missing is the diplomatic structure, which is 1 year from now, 10 years from now, 100 years from now, how are we going to coexist in the Middle East? Or should we coexist at all? Should we just pack everything up and go against our own people with ice? But so these decisions aren't being made. These are all knee-jerk, week by week. And the other thing that's really disturbing, which I have no evidence of, but everybody from Fortune to Wall Street Journal all of a sudden thought that, Donald Trump might be using this to game the market, or at least his associates, because there is now a pattern of say something scary, count to two, say something good. And these trades that are being made are quite substantial. I mean, if you look at the oil futures and the stock market shorting, people know what he's doing. So this is the GameStop world, which is a whole nother conversation about how logic doesn't make sense because the system is gamed. Not that it hasn't been, but we are now in a place where war might be a very favorable situation for making money.
Especially if you come out with statements and say, oh, up one day, down the other, oil futures, whatnot. And it's not just the Middle East. You also have Cuba, you have Venezuela, and you have Canada. And you have this idea of a return to the Monroe Doctrine. So do we see a continuation of what is happening in the Middle East and let them figure it out? Israel take what it wants, and we'll focus on the Western Hemisphere and carve out parts of Canada, take over Cuba, and whatnot?
Well, I hope we don't. But I look at it this way. I look at the long-term outcome of what's happening. Iran's oil goes to China, it goes to South Korea, it goes to India. It serves an entirely different marketplace. And then through its use in manufacturing, we buy things from those countries, right? So there's a point at which it'll hit us, right? The lack of energy. On the other side, in Europe, I see the lack of support for Ukraine having an equally detrimental effect, in which people won't view things as being safe and predictable. And, in order for markets to grow, in order for investments to be made, we need to know what's going on week to week, year to year. This is being removed from the global landscape. And I'm not a stock market guy. Like, I could care less about what the stock market says, but I look at how countries, when having disposable income or investment income, will say, do we go to America and buy that thing, or do we go to this country and buy that thing? And this takes us back to the multipolar world, where America is a detriment to stable investment, and other countries look a lot more attractive. Like places like Turkey, which are neither the largest or the smallest investment place, or Pakistan or India. People are looking at other markets because we're so volatile in the States.
What do you guys think? Robert Young Pelton, author, journalist, and a man with a lot of experience behind all of this. Do Google him and his series on the most dangerous places in the world as well. Leave your comments in the comment section. I'll see you next time. Till then.